Welcome, everyone. My name's Scott Arrieta. I'm the CEO of Unity & Company. We're the strategic partners that market-leading brands rely on to unify their leadership teams and transform their cultures. Now, every month, we host events like these for executives across a variety of industries with the goal of connecting senior leaders in the industry and sharing insights that spark conversation and an exchange of ideas that you can bring back to your organizations. So be sure to follow us on LinkedIn or sign up for our mailing list on unityandcompany.com if you'd like an invite to future events like these. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's discussion. All right, now we're here today to talk about an incredibly vital subject that affects every organization and leader today: trust. Specifically, we'll explore why trust in leadership is declining, and it's declining sharply, and what we as leaders can do to reverse this troubling trend. Now, in our time together today, we're going to cover why trust matters, the current state of trust, what's causing this erosion in trust, consequences of diminished trust, rebuilding trust, and what works. And then we'll explore a couple of case studies, one success case study and one failure case study. And then we'll talk about action steps for leaders. So first up, trust is foundational. Stephen Covey famously described trust as an emotional bank account, where each action we take either adds to or detracts from our balance. Without sufficient trust, even the best strategies fail, as employees, stakeholders, and customers withdraw their engagement, their support, and their loyalty. So today, we'll delve deeply into the reasons behind the trust deficit. We'll illustrate vividly its real-world consequences and provide actionable and research-backed strategies to rebuild and reinforce trust. Now, before we dive into the solutions, we have to first understand why trust matters. Now, Amy Edmondson of Harvard University is one of the foremost researchers on psychological safety, and she emphasizes the critical importance of trust for fostering an environment where innovation and productivity thrive. Psychological safety, Edmondson argues, is a cornerstone of high-performing teams. Employees who trust their leaders and peers take risks, they share ideas, and actively collaborate without fear of ridicule or punishment. Now, Gallup has also done extensive research on this, and it also confirms what Amy Edmondson has suggested, repeatedly showing that high-trust organizations outperform their peers in nearly every measurable category: profitability, employee retention, innovation, and customer satisfaction. Now, Simon Sinek emphasizes that trust is the foundation upon which successful teams and organizations are built. Trust is not constructed overnight or through grand gestures. Instead, it's built incrementally through consistent and authentic actions over time. So today, we'll unpack in detail how trust has eroded in many workplaces, explore the deep consequences of this erosion, identify clear, achievable paths to rebuild trust. Okay, so to understand why trust is essential to leadership and organizational success, we need to look at the foundational research and expert insights. Now, one of the most influential voices in this space is Amy Edmondson. She's a Harvard Business School professor known for her work on psychological safety, which she defines as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. In practice, this means that people feel safe to speak up, share ideas, ask questions, and admit mistakes without fear of judgment or punishment. Now, in her research, Edmondson found that teams with high psychological safety don't make more errors. They're just willing to admit them. In a study of hospital teams, those that reported more mistakes weren't performing worse. They simply felt safer telling the truth, which led to stronger learning and performance outcomes. This principle applies well beyond healthcare. Organizations across industries thrive when people feel safe enough to be honest, take risks, and contribute fully. Gallup's research reinforces this. High-trust workplaces consistently outperform their peers across key metrics: employee engagement, retention, profitability, customer satisfaction, and innovation. Trust isn't just a nice-to-have. It is a measurable driver of performance. Now, Simon Sinek adds another dimension by reminding us that trust is built not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent actions. It's about how leaders show up every day with authenticity, empathy, and reliability. Now, a powerful example comes from Google's Project Aristotle, which studied what made its best teams so effective. The standout factor wasn't talent or tenure. It was psychological safety. The team that trusted each other and their leaders communicated better. They were more resilient and consistently outperformed their peers. Now, Stephen Covey captures the concept of this with his metaphor of the trust bank account. Every interaction is either a deposit or a withdrawal. Ethical behavior, transparency, follow through, and empathy, those things build trust. Broken promises, inconsistency, and unethical conduct drain it and sometimes overdraw it completely. Now, Brené Brown takes it a step further, emphasizing that trust is the glue that holds teams and organizations together. Her work shows that trust is closely linked to vulnerability and courage, essential qualities in leaders who want to create connected, high-performing teams. Now, when trust is present, people report higher job satisfaction, lower stress, and a stronger willingness to collaborate and innovate. They stay longer, they perform better, and customers benefit too because trust inside an organization radiates outward. Taken together, the research from Edmondson, Gallup, Sinek, Covey, and Brown makes one thing clear. Trust isn't just important, it's mission critical. If leaders want to build strong, innovative, and resilient teams, cultivating trust must be a daily and deliberate practice. Now, as we move forward, we'll take a closer look at why trust is breaking down in so many organizations and how we can rebuild it from the inside out. Now, despite how foundational trust is to successful leadership, it's becoming increasingly scarce in modern organizations. According to Gallup's 2023 State of the Workplace report, only 20% of employees strongly agree that they trust the leadership within their organization. Now, let that sink in. 4 out of every 5 employees are either unsure or actively distrustful of their leadership. That kind of environment isn't just problematic, it's toxic to innovation, collaboration, and long-term performance. Now, imagine this. You're a leader unveiling a new strategic vision. You've put in months of preparation. You've outlined what you believe is a bold and clear direction. But instead of excitement, you're met with hesitance. Questions aren't clarifying, they're skeptical, and worse, the silence in the room isn't reverent, it's resistant. This reaction is happening in boardrooms and breakout rooms across the world. Why? Because the relational infrastructure that allows people to believe in leaders, the infrastructure of trust, has been eroded. Now, this is more than just an anecdotal observation. A 2022 study from Edelman's Trust Barometer showed that businesses is now the most trusted institution globally, but with an important caveat. While people trust business more than government or media, they do not trust business leaders. The gap between trust in institutions and trust in their leaders is growing. People may believe in the idea of businesses doing good, but when it comes to individuals in power, trust plummets. Now, this lack of trust doesn't just affect internal culture, it ripples outward. It affects how customers experience brands, how investors assess risk, and how stakeholders plan for the future. And this isn't just about perception. According to research from PwC, 55% of CEOs say that a lack of trust is a threat to their organization's growth. And even leaders themselves are acknowledging the crisis. Another factor in this trust erosion is the rise of remote and hybrid work. Now, while flexible work arrangements offer many benefits, they have inadvertently disrupted some of the traditional rituals that build trust. So casual hallway conversations, in-person check-ins, the nuances of body language, all of these contributed to a sense of connection and belief in one another. Now, in the world of Zoom calls and Slack messages, leaders must work even harder to communicate their trustworthiness. Compounding this is the generational shift that's happening in the workforce. Younger generations, so millennials and Gen Z, are entering and advancing in the workplace with a higher demand for authenticity, transparency, and purpose-driven leadership. If they sense dissonance between what a leader says and what they do, trust is lost very quickly. According to Deloitte's 2023 Global Gen Z and Millennial Survey, these younger workers are more likely to leave a company that doesn't align with their values or communicate transparently. Trust is no longer earned over years. It can be lost in days. Finally, high-profile leadership failures have a cumulative effect. So when news breaks about a CEO engaging in unethical behavior, or when companies make public missteps, whether related to social issues, layoffs, or data privacy, every leader everywhere pays a small trust tax. People begin to generalize. And even if you as a leader have done everything right, the collective experience of betrayal has made people wary. So what exactly is fueling this widespread erosion of trust? Let's break it down into some of the core factors that repeatedly show up across industries, supported by research, expert insight, and real-world examples. So number one, lack of transparency. One of the most significant contributors to trust erosion is a lack of transparency. Leaders sometimes believe that withholding difficult information protects the team or spares them from worry or avoids distraction. But what it actually does is breed suspicion. Amy Edmondson warns that when leaders are not open about the challenges that they're facing or the rationale behind major decisions, teams start to make up their own narratives. And those imagined narratives are often much worse than the truth. So for instance, consider the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. Companies that were honest about uncertainty, like Airbnb, retained employee goodwill, even in the face of difficult decisions. Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky wrote an open letter to employees explaining the need for layoffs with humility, clarity, and genuine empathy. It wasn't easy, but it was transparent and it preserved trust. The second is inconsistent communication. So trust is eroded when messages change from one day to the next, or when leaders fail to communicate critical updates. Now, in the book Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, they emphasize that for change to happen, leaders must not only provide a clear direction, but communicate that direction over and over again. People are often skeptical, not because the vision is wrong, but because they're not sure the leader is committed to it. So a striking example comes from General Electric in the early 2000s. Leadership under then CEO Jeff Immelt struggled with clear, consistent communication during times of transition. Analysts and employees alike were confused about the company's strategic direction, and the inconsistency made it harder for teams to buy in. So what's the lesson? Even the most well thought out strategy falters if people don't believe in the messenger. All right, number three, ethical failures. Nothing destroys trust faster than perceived or actual unethical behavior. Now, we saw this with Volkswagen's emissions scandal, where the company deliberately deceived regulators and consumers. The damage to trust was not limited to VW. The incident cast doubt on the entire auto industry's environmental claims. Now, Brené Brown emphasizes that trust is built in the smallest of moments, but can be lost in an instant when leaders fail to act with integrity. Ethical leadership requires more than compliance. It requires courage. Leaders must be willing to admit mistakes, take responsibility, and course correct publicly. All right, and fourth, unfulfilled promises. Stephen Covey's trust bank account is a very useful metaphor here. So every time a leader breaks a promise, whether it's about a raise, a promotion, or a company initiative, they make a withdrawal from that trust bank account. Make enough withdrawals without deposits and the account goes into overdraft. Now, Simon Sinek echoes this when he says, a team is not a group of people who work together. A team is a group of people who trust each other. And that trust is built by keeping your word, even in the small things. So consider the example of a manager who tells their team, you'll all be considered for leadership training this quarter, but then no one hears anything for months. Even if the delay was unintentional, the silence feels like a broken promise. So when leaders repeatedly make commitments and fail to follow through, or worse, fail to acknowledge when things have changed, employees stop believing anything will change at all. They disengage, they do the minimum, and they start looking for the exit. When trust erodes in an organization, the consequences ripple far beyond just the C-suite. They cascade through the entire system. Trust isn't a soft and intangible ideal. It's a measurable operational asset. And when it's lost, the costs are tangible and steep. So let's begin with employee engagement. Gallup's State of the Global Workplace report finds that only 23% of employees globally are engaged at work. And trust is one of the biggest differentiators between engaged and disengaged employees. Now, when people don't trust their leaders, they withhold their discretionary effort. They stop volunteering ideas, they hesitate to raise concerns, they become passive rather than proactive. Now, this shift might not show up immediately in quarterly results, but over time, it creates a culture of silence, a culture where people do just enough to stay employed, but not enough to help the organization to truly grow. Now, psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson has found, is the ingredient that allows for experimentation, innovation, and learning from mistakes. Without trust, psychological safety withers, and with it goes a team's creative potential. Brené Brown speaks to this dynamic when she says, you can't have connection without vulnerability, and you can't have vulnerability without trust. Without that foundation, people pull back, and so does their potential. Now let's talk about turnover. When trust erodes, employees start looking for the exit. And this isn't just a hunch, data backs this up. According to the MIT Sloan Management Review, a toxic work culture is 10 times more predictive of attrition than compensation. What's one of the key ingredients in a toxic culture? A lack of trust. The cost of losing talent isn't just in recruitment fees or onboarding time. It's in lost institutional knowledge. It's in the gaps left behind that put stress on the remaining team. It's in the customer relationships that walk out the door with your people. For every high performer who leaves due to distrust, a ripple effect follows. So let's put some numbers to this. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, estimates that the cost of replacing an employee can be as much as 6 to 9 months of that employee's salary. So for a mid-level employee earning, let's say $80,000, that's up to $60,000 per person in turnover costs. Now, if you multiply that by a whole department losing faith in leadership, and the organizational impact becomes staggering really fast. Distrust also disrupts communication and decision-making. So when people don't trust their leaders or each other, they're more likely to withhold information or act in self-preserving ways. This slows down projects, increases the likelihood of errors, and reduces the organization's overall agility. Trust, on the other hand, accelerates execution. As Stephen Covey wrote in The Speed of Trust, when trust goes down, speed goes down and costs go up. When trust goes up, speed goes up and costs go down. Then there's brand reputation. So externally, when a company is perceived as untrustworthy, customers and investors take notice. Consider what happened with Facebook, now Meta, during the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The breach of user trust not only led to congressional hearings and a $5 billion fine from the FTC, but also a substantial dip in public perception. Consumers today are more values-driven and less forgiving than ever before. Now, on a broader societal level, declining organizational trust feeds into a larger social trend: increased cynicism, political polarization, and disengagement from civic life. Edelman's Trust Barometer shows that people are increasingly turning to their employers as a primary source of truth, more so than governments or media outlets. This gives leaders not just an opportunity, but a responsibility to be a beacon of trust in a time where trust as a whole is in short supply. Now, when leaders fail to meet this responsibility, it can reinforce a dangerous narrative that all institutions are self-serving and untrustworthy. But when they rise to the occasion, organizations can actually become stabilizing forces in a turbulent world. So what can leaders do to rebuild trust once it's broken? Or better yet, prevent it from breaking in the first place? First, radical transparency. Start by telling the truth, even when it's hard. Radical transparency is not about oversharing. It's about proactively offering context, being honest about challenges, and demystifying decision-making. So Netflix, for example, has famously built a culture of radical candor and transparency. Employees are expected to give feedback directly and constructively, and leaders share strategic decisions and company performance. Amy Edmondson's research supports this, demonstrating that when leaders admit their own fallibility, teams are actually more likely to speak up. Vulnerability from the top creates psychological safety throughout the ranks. When leaders say, "I don't have all the answers," they create space for others to step in. Consistent and clear communication. So trust isn't just about the message. It's also about the frequency and the consistency of that message. So in that book, Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, they talk about the power of repetition and clarity when leading through change. People need to hear a vision over and over again before they start to internalize it. So a great example of this is Satya Nadella's leadership at Microsoft. Now, when he stepped in as CEO, he centered communication around a growth mindset and a clear cultural shift from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. He didn't just say it once. He said it at every opportunity in town halls, emails, strategy meetings, and interviews. Over time, those consistent messages shifted Microsoft's internal culture and external perception. Competence and reliability, number 3. Competence breeds trust. Leaders who consistently follow through on their commitments, who deliver high quality work, who model the behaviors that they expect from others, they earn the trust of their teams. Now, Simon Sinek reminds us trust is built on telling the truth, not telling people what they want to hear. That means being reliable and honest, especially in moments of uncertainty. Leaders who overpromise and underdeliver quickly erode trust. The inverse, underpromising and overdelivering, builds trust pretty steadily. Ethical leadership is next up. Ethics must be a non-negotiable part of your leadership framework. When something goes wrong, and eventually it always does, how you respond makes all of the difference. So let's look at Johnson & Johnson's response to the 1982 Tylenol crisis. It's an oldie but a goodie. 7 people had died from cyanide-laced capsules, and the public was understandably terrified. So J&J immediately recalled 31 million bottles. They halted production and advertising and cooperated fully with authorities. They didn't wait for regulators to act. They took responsibility swiftly and transparently. And as a result, their brand recovered and even strengthened. Now compare this to Wells Fargo and the fake account scandal, where leadership initially denied the extent of the issue and blamed low-level employees. That delay and deflection cost the company billions, not just in fines, but in long-term reputation. And finally, empathy and compassion. This is probably the most important piece. Trust is built through human connection. Brené Brown teaches us that empathy is not about fixing. It's about being present. It's about saying, I understand what you're feeling and I'm here with you. So let's consider Arne Sorensen, the late CEO of Marriott. Now, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Sorensen released a video message to employees. He looked tired. He was candid about the company's challenges. He expressed heartbreak over layoffs, and he did it with calm, heartfelt presence. The video went viral internally and externally, not because it was polished, but because it was real. That's what real trust sounds like. Now, as we continue, remember, trust isn't rebuilt with one grand gesture. It's reconstructed through hundreds of micro actions every single day. So up next, we'll explore real-world case studies that put these strategies into action and show you exactly how trust can be regained, even in the most challenging circumstances. So the strategies we've explored for rebuilding trust are powerful, but their true value comes alive when we examine them in the context of real organizations, ones that have faced significant trust crises and either navigated them well or faltered in their response. So let's take a closer look at 2 contrasting case studies. So first, Equifax. In 2017, Equifax suffered one of the most significant data breaches in corporate history. Personal data from over 147 million Americans was exposed, including social security numbers, dates of birth, and driver's license information. The public backlash was swift and fierce. Confidence in the company evaporated nearly overnight, and the company's initial response only made things worse. The former CEO, Richard Smith, was criticized for downplaying the scope of the breach and for a perceived lack of urgency. He stepped down shortly after the breach became public. Now, that's when Mark Begor stepped in as CEO in 2018. And his leadership provides a compelling example of how to rebuild trust when it's been almost completely lost. Now, his first move was to acknowledge the severity of the breach without defensiveness. He didn't sugarcoat the issue. He addressed stakeholders directly and communicated with a tone of humility, taking full accountability for the company's failure to protect sensitive data. But he didn't stop at words. He initiated a multi-year transformation strategy to rebuild Equifax's infrastructure and public image. So first, the company invested $1.5 billion into cybersecurity upgrades and technology modernization. These weren't just internal IT fixes. They were public commitments shared with customers, investors, and regulators alike. The company began releasing regular cybersecurity updates, introduced independent audits, and collaborated transparently with regulatory bodies. Now, additionally, he transformed the company's culture. He focused on employee engagement, ethical behavior, and operational excellence. By investing in culture change internally, he was signaling to the public that this wasn't a short-term PR maneuver. It was a full-scale trust rehabilitation strategy. And the results speak for themselves because by 2022, Equifax's stock had fully recovered. Regulatory scrutiny had eased and customer sentiment had improved. While trust is never rebuilt overnight, Equifax's example shows that with humility, transparency, and sustained action, even a broken trust bank account can be replenished. Now, let's turn to Wells Fargo, an equally large and respected financial institution, but one that offers a cautionary tale. So in 2016, it came to light that Wells Fargo's employees had opened over 2 million fake customer accounts in order to meet aggressive sales targets. Now, these accounts were created without customer consent, and in some cases, customers were charged fees for services that they never requested. Now, this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a systemic failure. Initially, the company's leadership was slow to respond. When they did, the messaging was inconsistent. Then CEO John Stumpf blamed the wrongdoing on low-level employees, despite clear evidence that the aggressive cross-selling culture was driven from the top. Rather than take accountability, leadership deflected, minimized, and delayed meaningful action. The public, the media, and regulators were not convinced. The trust deficit widened. Congressional hearings followed. Stumpf eventually resigned under pressure, but the damage was already done. By the time the new leadership arrived and attempted to rebuild, the company had lost years of goodwill, billions of dollars in fines, and most importantly, the trust of millions of customers. Now, even subsequent efforts to rebuild were hampered by lingering skepticism. A 2021 House Financial Services Committee report criticized the bank for failing to complete necessary reforms. Despite multiple leadership changes and public commitments to doing better, the legacy of the scandal continued to haunt them. So, what's the key difference between Equifax and Wells Fargo? Timing, tone, and transparency. Equifax leaned into accountability quickly, communicated clearly, and invested heavily in systems and culture. Wells Fargo, by contrast, responded slowly, spoke defensively, and blamed others. One invited trust through humility and action. The other reinforced mistrust through avoidance and misdirection. These two stories are more than corporate case studies. They're reminders that every leader has a choice in a moment of crisis. And when things go wrong, and they inevitably will, leaders can either face the truth and engage in the hard work of repair, or they can hide, deflect, and prolong the damage. So where do we go from here? We've explored the deep importance of trust, not just as a nice to have, but as a fundamental ingredient of organizational health and human connection. We've examined why trust is declining, the severe impacts of that decline, and clear actionable strategies for rebuilding it. Now, we've seen that trust impacts everything from employee engagement to turnover, from innovation to profitability, from brand loyalty to societal cohesion. And we've walked through the principles of radical transparency, consistent communication, ethical leadership, and compassion, and how these are not abstract ideals, but practical behaviors that build real-world trust. And we've seen that when faced with a trust crisis, organizations can either move towards repair, like Equifax, or deepen the damage, like Wells Fargo. Now, at Unity & Company, this is the heart of the work that we do. We train and coach leaders and teams not only to understand the dynamics of trust and psychological safety, but to build them intentionally. Through immersive leadership training, experiential offsites, and trauma-informed executive coaching, we help organizations develop the muscle memory to lead with empathy, clarity, and courage. Because trust isn't something that you fix once. It's something that you practice and that you build every day. Here are 3 things that I want you to take with you today. First, trust is your most valuable leadership currency. You spend it every time you make a decision, deliver a message, or respond to a challenge. So spend it wisely. Trust building is a daily practice. As Stephen Covey said, every interaction is either a deposit or a withdrawal from your trust account. So make those deposits deliberately. And last, you can start today. You don't need a crisis to build trust. You just need intention, consistency, and care. Now, let me end with a quote from Brené Brown. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. The work of leadership is the work of making things clear. Expectations, intentions, and emotions. It's the work of connecting, showing up, and doing the hard things in human ways. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. Now, as we wrap up our time, we have a couple of final pieces of value that we'd like to offer you. So if you are the only person to attend from your organization and you wish that you weren't, just reach out to us and we'll be happy to do an encore presentation for others in your organization. If something that we talked about today sparked your interest and you're interested in understanding how we could potentially partner together in the future, we'd also love to spend some time connecting with you so that we can understand your needs and share a little bit more about our capabilities. If you'd like to receive a recording of today's talk as well as some notes, just reach out to us at info@unityandcompany.com and we'll be sure to send them your